All right, everybody, we were already rolling into episode 8 of This Is the Year, the Swiss Artificial Intelligence podcast. And if you're completely new to the show, in this one, we usually deconstruct all things that you would need to be building great and cutting-edge artificial intelligence-based software. We have a vast array of last episodes already. We talked about all things MCP. Last time we talked about AI architectures. But today we really bring it one step further. We talk about different concerning points, especially if you would be building AI in your corporate world for your AI SaaS as an entrepreneur, or even if you're just trying out things as a student around Europe and around the world. Guys, I would like to quickly start with another topic though. You were in Portugal when this blackout happened. Was this caused by AI or what's the latest?
I think it was caused by our AI. So, as you may have guessed, we're building too powerful of AI, and they decided to shut us out because we're getting just too good at it. It was a target attack against me and Benny. So I'm sorry that Portugal and Spain and bits of France and Italy went out too. There was just collateral damage. There was just targeting specifically me and Benny. Other than that, yeah, we were totally in the dark for almost a full day.
So no single AI was running in Portugal and Spain.
No, it wasn't in Portugal. It was in Spain. We weren't aware that we caused that, man. Jesus, I was literally man, can we run this? This is the last training. I pressed the button and suddenly 20,000 megawatts disappeared from the network, and that's why it dropped. That's the reason.
I remember you called me
one in a row. That's why. Yeah, I called you straight away.
At 11:30, you were like, there is some blackout in your region. I was like, what are you talking about? And then you were completely offline. So Azure load balanced your AI somewhere else probably. And all the compute was then being done by some other country. But do you have any idea, very, very briefly before we get into the show, how this actually happened? Because I read some...
It was the reason. I wasn't joking. Basically, it was, according to the investigation so far, they managed to isolate the problem, and it disappeared some power. They're still trying to investigate to understand why the sudden drop of power in the grid, but a huge amount of energy disappeared from the grid, so probably some central collapsed the energy supply, and it was too much of a ask from the grid, and that's why. So, hence, we pressed the button to train.
The investigation is still ongoing. Yeah, so all the power or most of the power disappeared. Not very likely there's just one central, one power station that went out, because again, it's 60% of all power, I think, in Spain. Then it caused a ripple effect, and they shut us out in Portugal, and they had to shut the connection between Spain and France, otherwise it would spread even further. And I would very gladly see Switzerland get a bit of the power outage too, just so we could be on the same level.
Well, it wasn't really clear, to what extent this goes to somewhere else, right? So it was kind of interesting to know. So no HEI got activated or something that caused the power outage.
I think it might. Because if you think there's a lot of data centers they're building now in Spain from some clouds, so it might have been some AGI started to gain some life, and they were like, "Shit, we need to disconnect."
A little sarcastic disclaimers at the bottom, because we are usually a very informative, serious podcast, and if we start joking around too much, we might start confusing some people and start going into the conspiracy theory kind of side of it.
So I would have to do all the disclaimers in the edit at the end.
Do a disclaimer. I do have a standing joke with some people, because sometimes I get into the joke so much that nowadays what I do normally, before I even start the joke or after the joke, I just say disclaimer. Because
so they already know what's coming.
Yeah, because for the person to know that I'm joking a bit, I'm mocking, I'm teasing, because sometimes it can be too intense.
All right, gentlemen, let's get started into the show. Episode 8. We have a few topics around the corner. I think let's quickly start with some refreshers on the latest models that we kind of either tested or they were rumored, starting maybe by DeepSeek R2. Joao, you mentioned that briefly before the show. What's the latest on there? Maybe what can we expect? You set the bar, of course, fairly high, that it could be better than our one, of course, but what is there to be expected?
So DeepSeek changed the industry regarding open source. It was aggressively open source. Everything was clear and transparent, and people could replicate it if they had the hardware. And so given the talent and the amount of techniques we saw coming up used in DeepSeek R1, the expectation for DeepSeek R2 is quite high. We still have some very vague rumors, some Twitter leaks saying how much data was used to train it, how it runs, but supposedly we're going to get a multimodal model. So something that's very good at both audio, image, and text. And to combine those three and have actual reasoning on those different types of media and different types of input could be a very big thing. Because right now we do have reasoning models, but they work mostly on text. So they can understand images, but they don't integrate them as part of the reasoning. They don't use images as part of the reasoning. And so if we start to see better reasoning with multimodality, it opens up a new field in AI, and it opens up new possibilities for businesses to use them in real life applications. Expectations are high. However, this is still very much rumor. It's not anything is confirmed, and we're still waiting for the model. Hopefully, may come out in May come out this year, but it's up to the team at the DeepSeek labs to tell us.
I think the last model was really good because they were able to exceed expectation based on limited resources. So if we see a similar leap forward now, although maybe many of the NVIDIA chips flew to them to some extent, so they maybe do have some more compute resources. But that's maybe another hypothesis that we have to put into another show. Sorry, Ben, I interrupted you. What did you want to add for
No worries. I was just going to talk because regarding this point, we had a similar talk a few months ago, João, remember, regarding the reasoning. Because as we spoke, right now the reasoning, it's being forced to be in a language mode for us to understand what's going on. So it's not fully a black box. But if it was a black box, the models would be a bit better because they wouldn't have to be so restrictive on the thinking mode on being just the language. Because for the models, it's not about the language. It's about zeros and ones. And if you let them decide what's the best way for them to reason, the models would be better. They would use less tokens. They would have higher capabilities of thinking.
So if they're using basically their own language, basically.
Yeah, just something because people are listening. They might not be seeing. I just did air quotes on thinking.
We're going to start adding subtitles to your audio titles to your podcast.
Disclaimer.
But this it's been like a long time coming because even in DeepSeek R1, part of the paper, they mentioned that they had to add a loss function. So they had to punish the model every time it started to jump languages. So I speak more than one language, and it's totally normal for me to start speaking in a language. And if I want to use an expression or a word or a full sentence in a different one, then I'll do it. This is a very common thing. People cuss in different languages, use expressions in whatever fits them best. These models speak a lot of languages. And so what they were seeing in their training was DeepSeek R1 was using Chinese, French, Italian, English, like all the kinds of languages that it learned during its thinking. And to the researchers, this was a bad thing because you couldn't really follow what the reasoning was saying, or it was really hard to follow. You'd have to go to Google Translate a bunch. And so they added this function, say, hey, you can reason in any language, but you have to pick and stay in that language for the whole reasoning step. And they did, and they saw it degraded the performance a little bit, but it wasn't too serious of a hit that they kept it going. And this is something that most reasoning models do, and so researchers have to always adjust so the model sticks in one language. However, it makes sense that if a model knows many languages, it wants to use many languages. To go a step further, and the research that's coming out is saying that it shouldn't be even using human language at all. To force our way of speaking into the models is probably degrading them a bit. And if they can reason in their own language, if they can make up a language of their own, it's way more efficient. So for the business case, what it means is you get faster reasoning. So the model have to use less tokens because it's a very efficient language. It's a language that they made up specifically for reasoning. And also, so it's cheaper because it's less tokens and faster. The downside of this is that you won't be able to follow up what the reasoning was. And so the models get a bit more opaque and you don't really get a sense of how the model got to the solution. You can ask about it if you want to have a full detailed report of the reasoning. You can ask it and can have it as an output, but you can't see the process happening in real time.
But then you still have some translation step, no? I mean, if it comes out of their own basically built language for optimized inference, it should still then be translating to the desired user language at the end, or not necessarily.
Only at the end. So the reasoning step can happen in whatever language it picks, and then the output itself is in the language that you desire. But the reasoning is completely independent from the output.
It's a little,
But like,
yeah, go on, Bene.
sorry, regarding this aspect, if we wanted to try to translate first to understand the reasoning, I think as a human, that's normal, but we shouldn't try to do that. For instance, there was this a few years ago, or more than a few years ago, they put two AIs to create an encryption protocol, and they were talking to each other, and then they were talking in a way that people couldn't even decipher what they were speaking to each other, and this creates fear. And
It's where
just
the Terminator
kind of a
starts.
disclaimer, yeah, people will be like, okay, that's how AI was born. We allowed them to speak.
But it kind of is scary, no? Like you want to have
Yeah.
explainable artificial intelligence, huge research field. I remember from ETH Zurich, there was like this one course I was sitting in on explainable AI. There was always like this. It is a huge black box, so let's not make the black box more than it is already by adding more freedom, degrees of freedom for the AI model to even choose now their own languages or their own way of communicating. Of course, it's more efficient, but explainability is basically then impossible on the reasoning steps, and let alone if they're then actually communicating with each other in this, let's call it new way of communication or protocol, and then you're completely having no degree of understanding what's actually happening.
I think that's just giving innovation a chance, because in the beginning, with these deep neural networks, we couldn't see or understand. And after a while, when not Gen AI, like 2 or 3 years ago, you could see they started to create frameworks to give you explainability, to rerun. It would have some cost on post-processing for you to try to understand what was going on. But you could do that.
I was just going to make that point before. I mean, if you have deep layers on convolutions, you don't really know what's happening in these matrices, in the actual layers. And then at the end of the day, there is a large vector at the end, and then you have a classifier or whatever. It's just now it goes also into the inference step. Before it was mostly on the training, the uncertainty a little bit. Yes, you might have these tools on explainability, but now again on the inference, at least we more or less knew based on the tokens that we've seen or based on then the translated reasoning steps, this is actually happening between, let's say, the chain of thought, and now again we are removing that understanding. So it was a bit like the perceptron and deep layers. We didn't really know much. Now we had an initial, very first, let's say, actually explainable reasoning. And now again, we're removing that zone, and it's putting again into some uncertainty. I mean, you guys really think that's the way forward for faster inference, or is there another benefit to that as well? Getting more precise, or is there some lost translation
the
still?
are indeed getting better. So for the same amount of compute, for the same amount of training, you are getting better results. And so far, the benchmarks have been showing that. The latest research coming out of Meta, and Meta has been putting out a lot of really cool, interesting research and white papers. It's been going in a direction that, having an abstract reasoning step instead of a human language one is beneficial. However, this has implications. So on a very user level, you're used to seeing the reasoning step in ChatGPT or Gemini, where you can open and see what the model is thinking. In the near future, you might not be able to see it because the reasoning is completely incomprehensible for humans. But this will have another implication that's more of a medium-term to long-term implication, is that a lot of models that come out try to copy each other. So DeepSeek, it's known that DeepSeek used a lot of data out of OpenAI. They ran a bunch of prompts and they got a lot of data from them. And they do it to themselves and to each other a lot. And because this reasoning will not be visible anymore, and you won't see these abstract steps, their own models won't be able to copy each other anymore, or not as easily, because you don't have access to this data. So it's, let's say, a bigger obstacle to create these new models. And models are not only become a bit more different between themselves, they're going to have their own personalities a bit more, because they can't copy each other as much. So
exactly.
It will be an interesting.
I think it's a good thing, because I think this is the next step that we kind of need to go a bit on a higher, better level of AI, because we got to the point that right now they're just copying a lot of data from each other, and then they're being forced to, they're kind of being restricted. They should be free.
Guys, maybe if we can quickly segue to some other quick topic on the security front, maybe very high level. What are some security considerations if you're a Swiss business and you're building artificial intelligence-based agents? Now more and more, there is new tools coming out, new protocols, but sometimes security is a bit left in the background. What are maybe some high-level considerations for a company that they have to consider when, again, implementing AI agents?
Yeah, of course, we as developers, we like to, from not the security department, we are like, why do we need so much? Why do I care so much? But in the end, I understand it's business, it's sensitive data that we need to take care. But right now, most of the things are running on clouds, and it's inference, and people are afraid of these being used for training the model. But if you look and read those papers that no one wants to read, those terms and agreements, you can see, and if you're a big business, a big company, you can see that that data is not used for training. They just sometimes keep it for legal purposes, but they have a retention period that might not be too long or can be
It's usually
negotiated.
around 90 days. At least for Azure, it was 90 days a while ago. So
Yeah.
it's usually around that time.
Regarding this scenario with AI, Gen AI more specifically, the main concern for business is the ones that are set by law. For instance, here in Switzerland, the main concern, depending on the business that you are at, is the data not leaving the country. So you kind of need, again, model availability, and you have to play with that regarding the security. Otherwise, of course, you have some security concerns on cloud, but for those you would have that with most or any software nowadays, because we are seeing sometimes, I think we are seeing more, again, moving business to the clouds, and these are being imposed by AI. AI is making this, again, because some while ago, I think 10 years ago, cloud started to gain some traction, and then some business start to retain. But now AI is, I think, boosting the cloud's usage again. And I think from what we can see, cloud is very secure, and they have how can I say, they have a lot of points and security safeguards and very expert people doing their job properly for that. And they have specialty teams, and because of the terms and agreements that you sign with them, if that doesn't go well, it's on them, and the fine is not very nice.
When you hear about data leaks in some S3 bucket on Amazon that had some database and everything is now on the internet, it wasn't really the fault of Amazon or Google or Microsoft. It usually was the fault that the people that were using it, so that company, whatever company was using AWS buckets, left them open. And so if you set them to be closed or set them to be private or set them to be secure, they will be secure. Like Bennett said, there's entire teams whose whole purpose in life is making the systems very, very safe. Their GCP, for you to get an idea, Google's earnings report came out a while ago, and you could see their earnings, again, massive numbers. But you can see like GCP, which is not even, it's one of the top 3 clouds, but it's not the one that's being mostly used by businesses. And it's in the order of tens of billions of dollars in a month. So monthly billion-dollar income. Of course, not all of that is profit, but you can see that there's a very big interest on Google and Microsoft and AWS and all the cloud providers to make their systems very safe. So if you're building GenAI systems on the cloud, assume the cloud is safe. It's probably your usage of the cloud that might not be, but this is not anything new in GenAI. If you're worrying about someone copying your data into the models, then again, you have legal teams that can look at the terms and agreements, and you'll see that it's usually not the case. Of course, you can go to a super shady inference provider that is indeed stealing your data, but then again, that is your choice of provider. You might be saving up on some monthly costs on inference, but then again, paying up by losing maybe your data. Maybe.
Just to add up to that, I think it was a month or 2 ago, or maybe even less, there was this Google deal that hasn't gone through, but they made an offer. They're buying the Wiz cybersecurity company.
They bought it already.
They bought it, yeah. Okay. So yeah, they bought for like what, $30 billion? So yeah, you can see how much investment and worryiness they have regarding cloud security.
But I do think,
invest that amount.
It is an investment. It's certainly a core competitive area of Google to provide certain security now. But if you're still engineering around Gen AI in the cloud, I mean, you can still do some low-hanging fruits coverage, like exposure of API keys, like the super basics one. Simply because you're using a cloud service, you should not neglect like the old school of security thinking. Also, you don't have to necessarily put all the customer identifying data in the cloud to compute. You mentioned before the podcast, like masking, or maybe simple simply not sending every possible customer identifying data point to the cloud for it to be computed there. Maybe you can do a subset of that. Is that something that is like happening a lot on a day-to-day, the masking, or you first decide what has to be sent first, or you mask everything per se, or there's some limitations on that?
Security limitations, only reason why we mask stuff.
Usually, yeah, because these mechanisms of masking, they add time to development, right? And so, of course, it'd be better to send everything all at once and expect for the best. But because of security limitations and compliance legislation, we can have these mechanisms where, for example, if you want to send a credit card to an LLM, so you want for a customer center where the model is saying, hey, user, which one of your 5 credit cards do you want to block? The user might say the full number of the card, but you don't have to send the full number back to the model, only the last 4 digits. And the last 4 digits should be enough for the model to understand it's the second card. And it blocks the second card for you, and now you're safe because somehow you lost that card. Like, that's one mechanism. It depends on kind of data, so these are all very custom to the masking that you're doing. But it is possible and it is being done, but hopefully you don't have to have these many mechanisms because they do add time and they add complexity to an otherwise simple solution.
It's just maybe a high-level question, but let's say your day has 10 hours of work on AI engineering. How many minutes or hours are you considering security? Is it something that you're like, I mean, just from a mental model, is it like every single piece of code you write, generally speaking, has security in mind, or is it something you add at the later stage of your understanding after you've built it?
I think it depends on the part of the code that you're working on. If the part of the code that has more exposure, if it's the API interface or some connection to the cloud, I think you start to consider safety there because it's very important because you're connecting to some outside system. But internally, you're not kind of focused on security. You're just focusing on efficiency. Of course, depending on the data that you're handling, you have to consider security. But I think normally the frameworks already have that in mind.
Yeah, so around 10 hours, I'd say 1 to 2 are spent like focusing on security, but a lot more focus on the performance of the system. So the latency aspects, the quality aspects, and like the stability aspects. Otherwise, you have a really good solution. But if it breaks every half hour, then maybe not so great.
For
the
you,
security,
then, security
just to
and...
add,
Yeah, go on, Ben.
Sorry. To add the security here, you have, I think, 2 main aspects, 2 main fail safes or fail points, integration and people. So basically, it's either people that shouldn't be looking, and that's why we kind of need to mask things, looking through logs, and they were like, haha, or security on the storage isn't the best, and people go through the logs and they can extract the information, and security on the integrations, because those are where you can connect. So that's are the painful or the focus points for attacks.
Maybe just from a high level, I mean, guardrails for you is not a security topic, or it is part of the user experience topic, or where would you place them?
I think it's both. It's less on the security on the cloud security topic and more on the usage that you'd expect. Because I personally come from a cybersecurity background many years ago. And so I expect the worst from the user. I'm counting on there being some very clever users that are trying to break my system or trying to get some info out of it. And so you're always assuming that someone's trying to break your system. But that's not really the same as directly hacking your database or directly attacking your backend API. However, guardrails, very good system, but should run entirely parallel to your system, entirely parallel to your, let's say, core logic of agency, of your agents, because it's something that takes time and something that costs money too. So it's not some free feature that you can toggle, because running the systems, like, it's usually another LLM call or quite a few more LLM calls to analyze what's being done in real time. And this adds cost. So it's kind of a trade-off that you have to decide how much safeguards and how much guardrails you want to add, and how much are you willing to pay for it.
I mean, it really goes into the topics of the last week as well. I mean, you might link the actual executor agents for them to do the layers of work that you intend to do. Let's say you're a business and you have 4 or 5 agents, analysis agent, a report agent, like 4 or 5 of them together. And then on top of that, you have a guardrail maybe as well. So you have you need to really combine and ensure interoperability between all of them, or you only have the guardrail at the end. I think we talked multiple times about that, dynamic guardrailing, but maybe just for the audience, where do you start thinking about guardrails and how do you kind of architect into them?
So usually, in my view, you'd have those agents, like each one doing their own thing. You have the execution agent running the process, and no agent should be concerned about guardrails. Guardrails is, I'd say, an entirely different agent. And one agent is concerned with guardrails, but only that agent. Otherwise, you're adding instructions to, let's say you're building ChatGPT from scratch. The initial approach that ChatGPT had was they had instructions on a model say, hey, you shouldn't talk about this, you shouldn't talk about that. And it was kind of okay, but it breaks. And eventually people got those instructions from ChatGPT and they could see what the instructions were. So the main and the most popular way of doing this right now is you have ChatGPT and the instructions are, hey, be polite, talk about this, but they're all very general. They don't specify what they shouldn't talk about. And that is an entirely different call to the model where it says, hey, analyze this conversation. And if it sounds to start sketchy, if it talks about these topics or these topics, then cancel it. And so it's entirely different, entirely parallel. You're not ever talking directly to this guardrail agent, but the guardrail agent is always looking and listening into your conversation. And so it might be the case that you ask something shady, you start to get an output because the agent that you're talking to doesn't really care and starts to give you an output. But as soon as the guardrail agent realizes it, it cuts out and the conversation usually ends and it's flagged to be seen or to be managed by someone else. This is usually the best trade-off because you still have the security, still, I'd say, stopping conversations that are going a bit sketchy, but you're not slowing the process down, you're not slowing the conversation down, and you're not, let's say, deteriorating or degrading the normal user experience.
But it's really going beyond the hyperscaler guardrails they have intended and do we have in place, basically. Maybe that's just also important to mention. It's not something that you usually get out of the box. So you just deploy your agents on Azure and they're like, that's really good. Here is your guardrail. You have to think about
and the features.
They do have
those features, but I don't love them. I think they get triggered way too easily and you might have a totally innocent conversation it gets flagged by those guardrails and you're cutting out conversations from people, from real users that could be benefiting from a user, that could be benefiting your business and could be preparing to pay you, but because the guardrail got activated and they got cut off.
Exactly. So there may be
Yes.
they need to be configured, and also you need to basically be thinking what type of perfect guardrail you would want to have for your agents.
Here, so just to add, you kind of can have the guardrails analyzing just the input from the user because or the output from the model, because just to have in consideration the models itself, sometimes when they came out to the world, open source ones, for instance, they already have baked in instructions on stuff not to output, and you can sometimes see some models that then they have been fine-tuned to be allowed again to those uncensored models that you, air quotes again, just to be good, those uncensored models that you have on Hugging Face, they went through a training to be allowed to be uncensored. I think the DeepSeek one, it wasn't. It was guardrailing that was being triggered on their page because the model was allowed to say stuff, but when it was saying stuff that was not, air quotes, kind of allowed in China, you could see the outputs that have been generated and it would be cut. And this is happening on all the other chats. But it depends also on the training data and how they were trained and how it's kind of done in the inference part. And most of the cases, the output won't be bad if you already have a really nice input guardrail system. Because sometimes adding just more tokens in the input is not a big deal. The problem is the output tokens. And if you're analyzing again, if you already did a good job on the input, sometimes it's not necessary.
I mean, it's certainly a very large topic, but maybe if we can draw an intermediate conclusion. So far, I mean, we've talked about, again, these models are generating a new language to be communicating at somewhat faster. At the same time, we have our own guardrails as people engineering these systems. So this is like also a bit of a counter element. So we give them more independence in execution, in inference. So they're actually thinking and reasoning somewhat independently, but still we would want to kind of guardrail them based on maybe our own instructions. Is there not like let's say a bit of maybe a counter argument here, or how do we then need to build guardrails when they're actually developing their own language? Like, how do you then guardrail something that you don't really know?
You use the guardrails on the input from the user, and the output from the model. But then again, you won't be able to see the reasoning step of the model, but you can always see and hopefully read the output out of it. Because the output
then
will
you're
be
just
in
in and
English or
output,
in
okay.
whatever language you want. Yeah, on the reasoning part of it, the thinking part. But then again, you have the same thing happening with humans. You're talking with someone else. If that someone else is thinking, that's totally independent from you, and you can't really have access to the thoughts of that other person. And so it becomes a very human-like experience. However, in your agent, especially in your business agents, maybe you won't be able to see the reasoning in the future, but you always have access to the tools that they're using and how they're using them. And so if an agent starts to access your database, starts to access your CRM to see something about the user, you can always see what tool calls they're using. So what user are they searching for? What data are they searching for? What email did they write to send? So you can always have access to these tools. You can always have safety guards on these tools so they're not being abused by your system.
So security on the integration points.
Always,
Exactly.
yeah.
Better before we talk about your hat that has no logo on it, I just have two things maybe that could be interesting as well. That OpenAI, they launched this shopping tool calling, which I thought is really interesting. So now on ChatGPT, it's not related to ads, but the model will basically select particular products you might be wanting to look at. And I think that's maybe again a first step into the e-commerce world of OpenAI. This has been announced, I think, even with some code snippets to Shopify. Not really confirmed here, but that could be an interesting notion that we see more and more of. Again, we talked about that last week, search engine optimization via Google. Now you have, again, ChatGPT coming up with maybe shopping suggestions. The second point, and I would quickly want to get your opinion here as well, that I thought interesting, Satya was talking to Mark Zuckerberg, and he basically mentioned 20 to 30% of the entire code base of new projects, so greenfield projects, are being built by AI agents. Do you think that's a realistic or a very high or a very low percentage of Microsoft? Benna, you gave a very provocative statement before. What do you think?
Okay, disclaimer, as a joke, I said that's why it's not good product. That's why you have some of the blackouts. But putting jokes aside, I think it's normal, and I think that's the way to go, because let's be honest, as developers, we also use AI generated code to speed up our work. And as long as it's reviewed and done by good developers, it's just enhancing and speeding up the process. So I think it's a normal way to go. But if you do just vibe coding without looking at the code, and maybe some people are doing that, then it's not good. Then you will have troubles, and that's already happening at some companies. And I think that's the reason sometimes you kind of have these blackouts or these things, because people do things without realizing properly what they're doing, and then they create a security vulnerability or just a vulnerability in the code, and then things happen. Probably that's why the blackout here in Portugal also happened. Who knows?
I mean, in most projects, if you're going to Deloitte or Boston Consulting Group or like one of the big four consulting, even medium and small consulting companies, when you're hiring for a new project, a lot of these projects are being done by juniors, by interns, by people with very little experience, because it's cheaper for them and it's like a business tactic. So you'd have one senior guy and probably 6 much junior ones. And AI might not be writing code at the level of senior, but it's certainly beating out juniors and interns. And so if anything, you're getting slightly better code than you probably would, and faster too, because it writes way faster than an intern ever could, than a human ever could. And so, yes, there might be flaws and there might be some security patches needed down the road. It's super important not to do straight vibe coding into production, because that's just asking for problems and giving work to the pen testing teams later. But it is, I think, a normal thing. And I think in the long term, it becomes super cost efficient for these companies to use AI instead of entry-level coders. However, you might be seeing in the near future that these projects, they do need maintenance. And if they're going to grow and they're going to get into bigger code bases, one of the problems that we're having right now is a code base reaches a certain size, and it's not really understandable by the AI as much. And so if you ask for a new feature, either starts breaking other features, or it's entirely incapable of adding it or integrating it into your system.
I think
so this could be the case for humans too, but AIs are having this problem, might be fixed in the future, but it's not at the moment.
Just to add there, yes, but I think we're talking about this last episode. Context windows are getting great. So probably in the future, they're going to be better than humans because as you said, humans, they can't, right now, we still can visualize if you start the project. If you got into the project later on, it's hard for you. So I think AIs right now, they're already mid-developers who just got into the project and don't have the full visibility of the code base. But in the future, they will.
That's exactly the point I wanted to do. I mean, some use case, I use it probably every day, is code reviews. Because it has more understanding. Imagine you need to do code review of a junior developer. And you really need to understand a little bit, hey, what has happened? Again, context just mentally. And I feel that the model, I think that's also Satya mentioned that in the conversation, that code reviews have a huge success rate and are really having a low, let's say, error rate when it's being done by an agent, as opposed to the actual development of the code itself at first is only at 30%. But probably code reviews are much higher without knowing the exact numbers than at Microsoft, for example. Yeah, maybe last point, Bene, what's up with the hat? Why no logo or your logo? I think we once talked about it some weeks ago, but I didn't know you were going to wear it today.
The reason why I'm wearing this hat is because this is the year. This logo is just waiting for your business idea to jumpstart with us, with the products that we give you ideas or the products that we have. Well, this is just waiting for your next idea, our next idea. Well,
so it's an inspirational cap, basically. Are you gonna wear this next time as well? That would be good. Maybe we can put it as a habit.
Yeah.
Next week. So Temu has a lot of hat orders from you.
Revealing my sources. Come on, man.
Exactly.
It won't be here in 1 week. Maybe 2.
That's true, maybe in 2. Great, gentlemen, let's wrap it up. Maybe something to add to a closure note from you, João, or we are good to launch off?
I think we're getting really fast, not only in the podcast, but also in the AI world. The new models coming out, new frameworks coming out. And I think companies are getting better at building these kinds of solutions. And so do hurry up if you can do it, because it became more of a if you can do it and more of when you can do it. So time to market is increasingly important. New models are coming out that are faster and cheaper, so money is not really a problem anymore. Get to it.
Well, if you get the chips, it's still a problem. Everybody's compute constrained. Nobody can really scale. I think these things are prevailing in 2025 still. Bene, your final closing words, or you're good to go?
I missed the AI magician and AI wizard at the beginning, at the introduction.
I have to do an outro now. I have to do the outro now. All right.
Do the out saying.
I do the outro. All right. For the AI magician and for the AI wizard, this has been episode number 8 of This is the Year, the Swiss AI podcast. For the audience, once again, new episodes out every single week on most of the topics that just have happened, or maybe also looking ahead into the future. We'll be usually covering business cases, business ideas, workflows, work tools, all things you can do in the vast world of agentic artificial intelligence. Guys, probably next time physical, I see you for our AI panel. Looking forward to that. I think there were some people actually interested in joining. Many people will be in the room, so let's make this a good convo. Hopefully we can do some snippets as well on our socials. And yeah, see you in the next episode.
See you
together. Have a good one.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.